Hello everybody, this is going to be 17.2. So in the last section we talked about populism and the sort of urban versus rural disagreements going on during this time period. In this section we are going to talk about disagreements based on race, based on gender, and based upon ethnicity and immigration. So we're going to start with a quote from Ida B. Wells, who was an anti-lynching journalist and advocate during the late 1800s, who said, "Our country's national crime is lynching. It is not the creature of an hour, but the sudden outburst of uncontrolled fury or the unspeakable brutality of an insane mob. It represents the cool, calculating deliberation of an intelligent people." So, first we are going to focus on discrimination based on race in the South during this time period. So, this is sort of post-1877 after the end of Reconstruction. Reconstruction is over. As we saw last section, populism is having trouble catching on in the American South, especially with Redeemers in charge, these are Southerners trying to bring back sort of the ways of the Old South, very much against African Americans having power. They worked quickly to try to dismantle Reconstruction during this time. So, for instance, black schools in the South were given as very little money as possible in order to make sure that manual labor, simple labor, was the only option. There were also new laws that were written that imposed very harsh penalties for small crimes. Therefore, poor workers, usually African American, but also white, could be sent to prison, and these prisons were basically work camps, and the prison workers were sold to private companies as cheap labor, oftentimes living in terrible conditions. If you look at places like Angola in Louisiana, the prison, farm prison Angola, it shows sort of what this was like during that time. So here are some black laborers working on a chain gang in the late 1800s. One group that hated the prison labor system were unions, because the unions saw this cheap labor of the time period from the prisons as competition for the jobs that union workers wanted. They showed their displeasure in a variety of ways, including there was the burning down of a stockade where black workers were held, blamed upon the Knights of Labor. We also see sort of the failure of what's sort of called the New South during this time. As with a lot of America during the Gilded Age, sort of golden on top, pretty on top, with problems underneath, there were some improvements in the New South, but they didn't impact everyone and they didn't help everyone. There had been promises of what was called the New South after the Civil War. This would be a South defined by industrial expansion and agricultural diversification, so machinery and industry taking over from the old enslaved labor system of the past. However, you didn't really see it in the long runs. There were some people who were getting wealthy during this time, rich planters and merchants and industrialists. However, most of the lower to middle class working Southerners, both white and black, did not see the improvements of this time. Those who did see it were people working in mining, textile manufacturing, furniture, and cigarette making. It did become more machine-like, more industrial, and there were some poor whites who were hired by these factories. However, the low wages in these factories and also the fact that they had to compete against convict labor meant that the wealth did not spread beyond the managers and the owners of these factories. And the South still depended upon the North well into the 20th century for much of their goods and funds and success. So here's an example of this sort of expansion during this time of these industrial ideas. This is the Duke Tobacco Pack House in Durham, North Carolina. It started creating machine-rolled cigarettes instead of the hand-rolled cigarettes, or just sort of loose leaf tobacco that was sold during this time. The money for this, however, also paid for Duke University in North Carolina. Now, the lives of black laborers in the South were particularly dependent upon geography. Not every African-American Southerner lived in the exact same manner. There were some opportunities for African Americans living in the upper parts of Southern America, where they could find jobs in mines and factories, and some could even afford to buy their own land. However, the further south you got, the worse the conditions were. Most black families in the deep south, especially in the rural areas outside of the cities, were unable to get the money that they needed to buy the land. Southern cities did see a growth of a black middle class based on some African American workers who were able to get jobs in factories, perhaps were skilled or professional workers, educated bankers, doctors, shopkeepers, and undertakers. However, while they were able to acquire a modicum of wealth and were supported by sort of black communities in the city, they were rigidly segregated and restricted to basically non-supervisory work. There were very few African American managers in white factories. In fact, probably none. There were no black managers in white factories. There were some owners and managers in areas of the cities that were heavily African American. However, in white factories, they were not given the opportunity. Black women found that their work was mainly in the service industries, bringing in some money, but with very little chance of advancement. They were basically reserved as service industry, maids and cooks and nurses and things like that. The more modern jobs of typists or secretaries or other jobs such as this were restricted primarily to white women. Now, in the years after Reconstruction, black families that could get out of the South decided that this was the perfect time to get out of the South. About 1880, about 40 to 60,000 African Americans left for Kansas looking for jobs and a better life. They were actually there were African American real estate developers in Kansas telling them how glorious life was in Kansas. These groups were called the Kansas Exodus or Exodusters after the story of Moses. Many were unable to find work or better work in Kansas, but they decided that bad work in Kansas is better than really terrible work and terrible conditions in the Deep South. And so most of them who fled to Kansas stayed in Kansas once they got there. However, many could not afford the trip to Kansas, and so many African Americans were just stuck in the South, unable to afford to leave. Many northern factories were not hiring African Americans too. Most hired white immigrants and migrants from the farmlands. Black workers weren't hired in major northern cities until the Great Migration of World War I, which we'll take a look at in a later chapter. So here are some Exodusters in Nicodemus, Kansas. This is more or less a ghost town these days, but it was basically a city set up to be an African American enclave in Kansas. And it was set up by this man right here. His name was Benjamin Pap Singleton, who was alive from 1809 to 1900. He was born enslaved. He became an abolitionist and later became a real estate agent and sort of hype man for the Exoduster movement. He worked to create black colonies in the Midwest and is actually featured in the book of 100 Greatest African Americans. Now, after the end of Reconstruction, we do see that political possibilities for African Americans slowly dissolved as well. Not right away. It wasn't like, 1877 and the lights turn off. But slowly but surely, African Americans did lose their ability to become office holders, and they lost their positions of power in the American South. So, for instance, some were able to hold on until the 1890s. However, through redistricting, intimidation, lack of public support, these mostly Republican black lawmakers were forced out by white Democrats. Redistricting, by the way, is known as gerrymandering. It basically means that you redistrict so that you can sort of have power over who's going to be your candidate and who's going to win. Now, women did play a part in trying to maintain some black political power. For instance, the National Association of Colored Women worked for women's rights, but also advocated for respectable living, cutting back on drinking and working to create a proper home life with the idea that maybe this would convince white Americans that African Americans could be trusted in positions of higher power. Now, we'll see that this National Association of Colored Women is separate from the white suffrage groups for basically reasons that, they had separated after the Civil War. So here are some members of the NACW. Some African American social movements of the late 1890s focused on economic improvement and basically said we have to stop agitating for rights and start focusing on economic development and improvement. One of the most famous advocates for this was Booker T. Washington. Washington was born enslaved, educated in Virginia, and he gave a speech in 1895 called the Atlanta Compromise, calling for black Southerners to sort of roll with segregation and focus on learning how to be farmers and skilled laborers instead. So here is Booker T. Washington, 1856 to 1915. Like I said, he was born enslaved in Virginia. Later on, he became an educator, the co-founder of the National Negro Business League, and the founder of the Tuskegee Institute of Alabama in 1881. And he believed in spreading African American education and entrepreneurship. He did not want to focus as much on fighting against Jim Crow. So he was not an agitator. He was basically trying to keep his head down and expand through economic opportunities. Washington used the Tuskegee Institute to teach vocational training. That is, it's a college where they focused on teaching you job skills instead of teaching you history or science. It's almost like a college, one of those local colleges that teaches like plumbing and how to become an electrician, but doesn't teach you, history or philosophy, basically. And he had advised his followers that segregation was around and it wasn't going anywhere. And the best manner was to keep your head down, not cause trouble, and to ask for help for white businessmen, and to be dependable, to prove, basically, that African Americans could be dependable workers. Washington did receive support from many white Northerners, and also some middle and upper-class black families in the South, and also from African Americans who just decided that going head first into fighting segregation was not going to get you anywhere. You needed to kind of do a flanking movement instead. It's important to realize also that he did have his critics. Later on, in a later chapter, we are going to talk about W.E.B. Du Bois, who did not agree with the Booker T. Washington method of escaping poverty. Now, also during this time, in the face of fraud and intimidation, there were still many black voters who continued to vote until basically they were forced out of voting. During the Gilded Age, Southern states created laws that basically went after them by using their poverty against them. So, for instance, the 15th Amendment says that all people can vote, and that if you, all men could vote, I'm sorry. And if you try to stop a man from voting north or south, it can have an impact. So instead, they use state laws to go after them and disenfranchise African American voters. They created poll taxes, which required voters to pay in order to vote. They used literacy tests to make sure that they couldn't vote. And they used other tests to show that voters could understand the Constitution, basically by forcing them to recite it in large passages. Some states also did institute what's called a grandfather clause, which was a way to exempt white people. It basically said, look, if your grandfather could vote before 1861, then you get to vote now without using the poll tax or taking the literacy test. So here's a sign for a poll tax. The 1964 24th Amendment actually says that poll taxes are illegal within the United States now. Now, although some states said these restrictions were basically created to prevent corruption, some were blatant about it. Some newspapers specifically came out and said that this was created to ensure that whites would always be sort of racially superior to African Americans. Now, thousands of white Southerners did also lose the right to vote due to things like poll taxes and literacy tests. However, it was the black community that was hit the hardest by it. So by 1940, about 3% of adult African Americans were registered to vote in the South at all. And these laws and restrictions were also allowed by the Supreme Court in several decisions. We're going to see the Supreme Court oftentimes is either the upholder or the defender of certain rights amongst minority groups. Now, with restrictions against African American voting, segregation laws increased throughout the 1890s, and the Supreme Court generally supported these segregation laws. So, for instance, in the civil rights cases of 1883, the Supreme Court invalidated the Civil Rights Act of 1875. It allowed segregation in most public spaces, basically saying that the 14th Amendment protected African Americans from discrimination by the federal government, but not by private businesses. So private businesses could segregate and discriminate as much as they wanted. This is an important one. So Plessy v. Ferguson of 1896 fully allowed state-sponsored segregation. It said it is totally fine, and this would not go away until Brown v. Board of Education in the 1950s. The case was that Homer Plessy, a black man, actually a man of mixed race, in Louisiana, was arrested. He purposefully sat in a whites-only railroad car in New Orleans and was arrested for it, and took his case to the Supreme Court, hoping that they would overturn segregation. However, he did not get his wish. The court decided that segregation was allowed as long as the states offered separate but equal amenities to both whites and blacks. They were separate, but they were not equal. The court decided against Homer Plessy 7-1. Some people do remember Judge Harlan, who gave that one dissenting vote, saying that our Constitution is colorblind. That really shows that sometimes, even with these sort of horrendous decisions by the Supreme Court, sometimes there is that one dissenting vote that people go back and remember after it's over. So here's just one example of segregation within the South following Plessy v. Ferguson allowing it. After Plessy, Southern states very quickly segregated almost every aspect of community and life, from churches to theaters to drinking fountains to bathrooms to taxi cabs. There were no public high schools for black students in the entirety of the South following Plessy, and grade schools really showed the hypocrisy of separate v. equal. Basically, some people have almost referred to them as cattle cars. They were small, they were dingy, unkempt, horrible. And these laws were not just they were not there for racial segregation, not for the division of the races, but in order to ensure that one race had domination over another one. Now, in some states, the laws did not stop certain other groups, like Chinese or people of Mexican descent, from interacting with whites, going to school with white people, but specifically singled out African Americans for discrimination. Now, African Americans also faced the rising threat of lynching during this time, especially if you were seen as someone who had achieved wealth or achieved some notoriety in the black community, or perhaps were an agitator of some sort. This was a murder by usually a white mob without trial. Between 1880 and 1905, there were at least 50 people lynched in each year throughout the South. By the mid-20th century, the number of dead by lynching had reached over 4,000. Now, in general, we think that a lynching is something that you don't want to make public. It is, of course, an illegal act. However, lynchers had law enforcement on their side. Law enforcement refused to stop them, either out of fear or because they were acting along with them. Some lynchings were carried out in public in the daytime, with men, women, and children, a carnival atmosphere almost for the people who attended these killings. After they were lynched, many of the black men were accused of sexually assaulting white women, which sort of justified it in the minds of many lynchers as they were preserving white purity. Now, there were people who spoke out against this, most prominently the woman who we started this lecture with a quote from, Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells was a black journalist from the South who wrote very harsh, scathing editorials about lynching, refuting these claims and saying that lynching was an evil perpetrated upon the black community. However, she eventually had to flee north for safety. Mass murder on this level and for this length of time was not matched in other countries in the long-term basis of it, from the 1870s up through basically the 1950s. That is a long time for this to be happening, and in general, most people did not talk about it. So here is Ida B. Wells, 1862 to 1931. She was born in Mississippi. She was an author, journalist, activist, and anti-lynching advocate. Her father was a trustee for a historically black college called Rust, and she went there and eventually attended Fisk University, which is another HBCU, I believe, in Memphis. Eventually, she had to catch a train out of the South, or else they were going to kill her. And eventually she settled in Chicago. She, however, did not stop her activities in Chicago. She actually helped to organize a boycott of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair because of its lack of African American representation in the story of America up to this time. Now, in the 1880s and 90s, most white politicians in both the North and the South were focused on the idea of reconciling the nation, bringing the nation back together, reharmonizing. And in general, that meant that the idea of African American rights sort of went to the background or the wayside. It was back burner sort of stuff. The hope for racial equality was erased, especially during the time period from 1880, 1890s up through the 1930s and 40s. The Civil War, the narrative of the Civil War, became one of white people fighting white people, brother versus brother, and the things that both sides were fighting for were non-racial political goals, such as states' rights in the South and preservation of the Union in the North, and emancipation sort of disappeared as a reason for the war. Here's an example of sort of the reharmony going on during this time. This is Cuba Libre. This is what is a staged photograph with a Northern and Southern veteran shaking hands in the late 1890s. The child behind them represents the cause of freeing Cuba from the Spanish, which was seen as a cause that was reuniting the nation following the Civil War. Now, slavery was relegated to a minor issue. If it was talked about at all, it was talked about as sort of, not really the cause of the war. This is the beginning of what we see as called the happy slave, myth of the happy slave. We also see that Reconstruction was classified as a mistake that brought about years of corrupt rule throughout the South until finally the Southern Redeemers kicked out the African-American lawmakers. This coincides with something that we talked about back in Reconstruction, which is the lost cause history of the Civil War. This narrative that romanticized the pre-war South, justified segregation following the war, and sort of ennobled Southern leaders and Southern politicians and soldiers of the Civil War as sort of martyrs fighting for a cause not about slavery, but about, sort of gallantry and sort of fighting against this idea of that basically it was not about slavery in general. The evils of Reconstruction and the happy slave are often echoed in history books of the early 20th century and pop culture also of the early 20th century. A couple of weeks ago when we covered Reconstruction, we talked about Birth of a Nation, we talked about Gone with the Wind. This is the opening sort of scroll of Gone with the Wind, which said, "There was a land of cavaliers and cotton fields called the Old South. Here, in this pretty world, gallantry took its last bow. Here was the last ever to be seen of knights and their ladies fair, of master and of slave. Look for it only in books, for it is no more than a dream remembered, a civilization gone with the wind." Now, let's look at redrawing the boundaries for other groups during this time period. African Americans were not the only group affected by the restructuring of American class and race during this time. We see resistance to immigration, class labor disagreements, the fight for women's rights, and this is a time where all these sides are struggling for power, sometimes gaining power, sometimes losing power. During the 1890s, approximately, let's start with immigration. 3.5 new immigrants arrived in America during this time. Some were, there are push factors and there are pull factors. Religious persecution, political persecution are pushing them out of their home countries, and what's bringing them in is the idea of American prosperity. These, what are called new immigrants, were coming from new areas. They're not coming from England and Ireland and France and Scandinavia. This time they are primarily Southern and Eastern European, Italy, Russia, the Balkans, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Many of them are Catholic, many of them are Jewish, which is relatively new as well. And many of these new immigrants were derided as lesser races by what are called nativists, anti-immigrant Americans who lived here already. They were derided because they were willing to work for lower pay. Some of them are viewed as a danger to democracy, that they held sort of these radical anti-American, anti-democratic ideas. They were a danger to democracy. So here's a political cartoon called The High Tide, which shows that Uncle Sam is fleeing this riffraff immigration flood that's coming in. And some of these guys have things on their hats that say like anarchist and pauper and illiterate and several outlaw, things like that. Now, American natives also criticized these new immigrants to America as a threat to sort of the purity of America. We saw this a little bit with African Americans in the South, that they were seen as sort of a threat to the white supremacy of this time. This was also partially in response to the idea that, America is becoming a power on the world stage. We're going to talk about that in 17.3. And that, we're doing a lot more business with these other nations. And so people were worried about these other nations sort of getting into America and changing things. Now, in response to a lot of this new immigration, there were new groups like the Immigration Restriction League. They blamed new immigrants for issues like poverty and crime and drunkenness, and they called on Congress to restrict the number of immigrants coming into America. Some new laws passed by Congress during this time refused entry to people from other countries with mental disabilities or people with extreme political viewpoints like anarchy, trying to take down the government. Many new immigrants were also stopped from voting with similar literacy tests that stopped African Americans in the South. Now, perhaps the most excluded immigrant group during this time were the Chinese. Starting in 1875, Chinese women were the first group to be excluded from entry into the United States, as they were stereotyped as prostitutes. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act barred all immigration from China, full stop. And this was the first time that we see a specific group being refused entry into America. Chinese Americans were also, if you were born in China, born in America, but were a person of Chinese descent, you were forced to register with the government and basically carry an identification card, or you could face deportation. Some followed this rule, some refused to out of principle. In 2012, actually, Congress passed what's called a resolution of regret for how Chinese Americans were treated during this time period. So here is a political cartoon, the only one barred out, where a Chinese American man is left sitting outside the gate of liberty while communists, nihilists, socialists, Fenians, and hoodlums are allowed in. Here also is an identification card of a famous Hollywood actress named Anna May Wong from 1924. And so this is one of those ID cards that we're talking about. Now, Chinese Americans use like the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments to try to reclaim some of their rights and combat this discrimination. In 1885, a case before the California Supreme Court called Tate v. Hurley required public schools to admit Chinese Americans who had been refused education for over a decade in these schools. The Supreme Court case of U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark also decided that Chinese Americans were allowed the same rights and benefits of Americans under the 14th Amendment. If you're here, you're an American. However, the court also did uphold some restrictions on things like Chinese immigration and also the deportation of Chinese non-citizens. Now, looking at labor, the labor movement from this time also saw change away from the more radical social movement of like the Knights of Labor and towards more specific labor-focused goals. They were not trying to change the world, they were trying to change the working hours. So the Knights of Labor had disappeared after several violent riots. Now, some were violent riots that started because of the Knights of Labor. So we saw those riots at the steel mill factories and the Pullman houses and things like that. However, the Haymarket riot was sort of blamed on the Knights of Labor, even though it wasn't them. In their place, after the Knights of Labor disappeared, came the American Federation of Labor, known as the AFL. This is a union that called for skilled workers, people who were educated, electricians and plumbers and people who had to be trained to do their job. And it was much more about getting workers' rights, allowing workers to call for better wages and lower working hours. And their leader, Samuel Gompers, called for a freedom of contract, but he also excluded many groups, including African Americans, women's, immigrants, and unskilled laborers. So he was focused and more streamlined on the idea of achieving goals that were practical. So here is Samuel Gompers, 1850 to 1924. He was born in England but moved to America. He was a cigar maker and a union leader. Although he was an immigrant, he was not in favor of expanding immigration because he thought that new immigrants coming into the United States lowered the wages of union workers here. And a famous quote from him is, "Show me a country that has no strikes, and I'll show you the country in which there is no liberty." Now, women's groups during this time also saw an expansion of goals, but at the same time, they were seeing a rise in discrimination. So, women by this time did have property rights in most states. So, it was no longer that the husband controlled every dime that the woman owned. And many were also members of the workforce. However, women also used things like the cult of domesticity, saying that, we are basically women pronounced that they were defenders of, the home and safety in the home, and they rallied against things like drinking. They basically said that, men are drinking up their wages, and when men do that, they're hurting the family, and the family is the woman's domain. We also see groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, led by Frances Willard, and these groups advocated for both temperance and women's suffrage during this time. Meanwhile, these groups also restricted their membership, however, to certain groups, and they espoused beliefs that aligned with the time period. So, for instance, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, called NAWSA, formed in 1890, called for voting rights, but only for women of certain ethnic groups and certain races, saying that only superior races and educated people should be allowed to vote. They also said they were against the vote for immigrant women of the time. Now, we'll see this continue later on.